Every 11 seconds, there's a new ransomware attack. Oil pipelines, universities, corporations, all paying millions of dollars. Barracuda says, don't pay the ransom. Before a ransomware attack occurs, train your teams to recognize an attack and use anti-phishing technology. Protect your applications, and they can't get onto your network. Simple backup and restore solutions quickly recover your data without paying the ransom. Build your ransomware protection plan now by visiting securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda. It helps if I unmute my own microphone. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. A couple of quick announcements before we get started. Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December through the 5th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista. We're excited to announce our list of speakers: Leslie Carhart, John Strand, Alyssa Miller, Dave Kennedy, O'Shea Bowens, Nick Leghorn, Justin Kohler, Jay Beal, Trenton Ivey, and Ryan Cobb, as well as many others. Please visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to register and check out the Rockstar lineup. This segment is sponsored by Acunetics, an Invicti company. You can visit securityweekly.com/Invicti to learn more. Joining us tonight is Benjamin Daniel Mussler. Benjamin is a web application security researcher at Acunetics and joins us today to discuss securing iframes with the Sandbox Attribute. Ben, welcome to the show.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on the show again.
Yeah, it's always nice to have you back. You bring a lot of energy to the show, Ben. I have to really make sure our seatbelts are buckled before you get started, so you may proceed and give us a little background on securing iframes.
Okay, I think the best way to talk about iframes is to first say that it stands for inline frames. And so we can start with frames, basically. And I would like to give some context and go back 30 years, actually, to look at the original frame set.
Oh, wow. You're bringing up really bad memories now. Some really awful-looking websites.
That's the point, because when you start with something bad, then it gets better quickly. So 30 years ago, we had frame sets. And as many will remember, we had frame sets for things like navigation, or to have a fixed header or a fixed footer on the site. And we used them mostly in a bad way, because it made it very difficult to bookmark pages, for instance. You may remember you had a navigation menu on the left side. It was a frame set. You clicked on one page to load it a subpage on the right side, then you bookmark the whole thing, and once you open the bookmark, you are back on the home page, actually. Right. And that was a big problem, especially with complex or very large sites like documentation.
Yes.
And that is one reason why frame sets are no longer in use. So like I said, accessibility was one reason, usability was one reason. I suppose there were also certain commercial reasons, because it affected the search engine optimization. When that was another issue, actually. You had a search result, and you click on that search result in Google, or back then Yahoo or whatever it was, and you ended up on a subpage without a navigation menu. Does that ring some bells? I guess it does, at least for me it does. And bad times, as you said.
Yeah, you could get lost in the navigation. Navigation was really hard. Now I feel really like hard. Websites just generate that for you when you're developing web applications.
Correct, yes. And interestingly, many websites nowadays, they still sort of look a bit like they have frame sets, but they don't have frame sets.
Right.
Because, we didn't have frame sets back then because it was so terrible, but because we didn't have anything better. But the general usability concepts, I think they have survived because they provided valid use cases. It's just that technology was so bad back then.
Yeah, we didn't have. Did we have JavaScript? If we did, it wasn't as prominent as it is today, right?
We had JavaScript, actually. It was used as a crutch, basically, to get you back to the frame set page with a navigation if by accident you entered the site through the subpage. And that was terrible to navigate. It was bad for SEO, as I said, and for screen readers especially, because I mentioned accessibility. It was just not that great.
That was the first time I saw JavaScript was like that. The very first time I saw it was I was trying to figure out how to get from down below back up. That because if they didn't, okay. Sorry, Ben.
No, please, exactly. And that's why we no longer have frame sets, at least not on modern sites. Occasionally, you come across some frame set, but these are very outdated sites. So nowadays, we do not have frame sets anymore. But interestingly enough, what we still have are iframes, and they've been around for a while as well. It's sort of funny because 20 years ago, iframes seemed a bit like the even worse option compared to frame sets. Iframes are like a frame set within a page. You can think of a little rectangle that contains a different page. And from a usability point of view, that sounds even worse than the original frame sets, but somehow iframes are still around. And there's a good reason for that, because iframes allow us to embed external resources. So think of widgets or those Facebook like buttons, Twitter tweet page buttons, but also ads, which is maybe not that great, but it's still a viable use case. So yes, we have iframes and they serve a purpose and they don't get in our way because usually we do not have to interact with iframes the way we used to interact with frame sets. So iframes are also useful as a security measure because, like I said, they allow us to embed external resources. But still, the iframe allows us also to separate the external resource from our own page. And I mentioned ads for a minute, advertisements. Again, if I go back 20 years, you had little banners, and usually you just had the URL of the image, and you would embed the image, which was not that bad, but it didn't give the advertiser much control. Of course, they could change the banner, but they couldn't do much else. And then we sometimes had scripts that you embed scripts in your website that serve the ad. But that's a security issue because you don't really want to embed somebody else's scripts in your site. Sure, we still do it, but if you can avoid it, you don't want to do it. So what we do now is we use often iframes, and the iframe contains the ads. And the nice thing about iframes is, like I said, they allow for a certain separation of content, of resources, of origins. And they have a so-called sandbox attribute. And basically, that's what I'm going to talk about. And that is why I wanted to give some background, some context about the original frame sets and how we got here.
Sweet.
Yeah, I'll just continue then. So the sandbox attribute, like I said, you can use the sandbox attribute to tell the browser that the contents of the iframe should be restricted. And once you use the sandbox attribute, the browser will limit what the iframe content can do. For example, it will, and then you can use the sandbox attribute to lift individual restrictions, like allowing scripts or allowing pop-ups, allowing downloads, all these things that you may not want to allow all iframes to do, because with external resources, you may not have full control over the iframe. So, and I will just quickly go through certain directives that you can use with iframe sandbox, and I will try to explain when you should lift certain restrictions and when you might not want to do that.
And these restrictions, Ben, they apply to the browser. Browsers interpreting and enforcing these restrictions, correct?
Correct, yes. Browsers enforce the restrictions. Nowadays, we have wide support for the sandbox attribute and the different values you can set. So all modern browsers will allow developers to lift restrictions. And maybe before I start, I should explain why you may want to lift restrictions. For example, I mentioned Facebook, Twitter. if you want your users to be able to interact with the iframe that loads resources from other sites, you sometimes actually want to allow that iframe content to execute JavaScript, for instance, or you wanted to have access to cookies of that original site. Because to get back to the social media example, if you want to allow visitors to share information about your website on their social media platform, then you need to allow users to make use of existing authenticated sessions, and that usually works through cookies.
Gotcha.
So I'm going to ask a question real quick. So if you have the iframe attribute and you don't sandbox it, you can almost anything can run there, right? Unless
yes, and that is actually the reason why at some point someone thought that's not great, and we want to have the sandbox attribute.
Right, because you could put scripts, you can put anything in there if it's not sandboxed, and then you can allow it in the sandbox, but if you don't do the allow, it's like a automatic deny when you put it in sandbox. Am I right about that, or am I misremembering?
You're absolutely right. Yes, that was a great summary, and you bring up an important point, because when you use an iframe to embed external content, you are sort of entrusting the security of your users, of your visitors, to that third-party site. And in many cases, that trust is just not warranted, because you can control the security of your own site, but not that of your of the site that you embed. Say third-party advertisers. If they get hacked, if some attacker manages to inject code into their site, then it might suddenly impact your visitors. And there were many cases where malicious ads were served exactly that way.
It sounds like you're making the explanation of sandboxing makes it sound like that would eventually sandbox would be the default behavior because it's the security boundary it adds. Is that a correct assumption or incorrect? Or is it too soon?
I understood that more as a suggestion, which sounds reasonable, but I guess it would break a lot of sites. So we have to take care of backwards compatibility. And I guess that's the reason why we have it a sort of opt-in with the sandbox attribute. And then you can, again, opt out of certain individual restrictions, which gives you more granular control over what you want to actually allow.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Ben. Carry on.
Yeah, and so just to give an example, there is one sandbox directive that is called allow forms, and it will allow the visitor to submit a form that is contained within the iframe. Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is it not having the directive will not block the form being visible, but it will just not allow you to submit the form. And now the question is, why would you actually want to block forms? Why would you want to allow forms? And one example is that if you have an iframe in your own website and it points to an external resource, it shows a form where users can enter, say, their name, their email address, then again, you somehow inherit trust. A visitor sees that form on your site. They don't even know it's an iframe. They don't even know it's an external resource. They don't know that if they enter their name, if they enter their email address and submit that form, it will not be submitted to you, but to a third party. And maybe you just don't want to give advertisers or whatever content you embed with an iframe, you just don't want to give them the opportunity to ask users for information like that. So it's about trust, but it's about data to some degree. It could be about social engineering if an attacker manages to compromise the advertiser's site and then displays a form. And of course, it could be about phishing as well, because if you have a phishing campaign and now the phisher can actually point users to your site, which contains an iframe, which in turn contains a form. And to end users, it's just not that clear where the form is actually posting data. But again, we have the allow forms directive, so there has to be a good reason why we would allow iframes to accept form input. Now, one example would be, and that is an example that we see very often, payment processors. If you have, let's say you have an online store, you have an e-commerce site, and you want to accept credit cards and you want to accept other payment options, but you want visitors to stay on your site. There are some implementations where you use an iframe to embed that payment form to allow users to enter their payment information. And I think that is a good use case to allow form input. Others would be, let's say, newsletters. Maybe you have an email newsletter, which is handled by an external provider. You want people to be able to sign up, and you embed that form so that users submit their email addresses directly to that newsletter service. Could be for data protection, that you do not have to handle that data yourself, PII, whatever. Similarly, there are shout boxes or these little chat windows that you embed that act like a form that you might want to embed as an iframe. So there are many good reasons why you want to allow forms to be submitted in an iframe. And if you want to do that and still benefit from the sandbox protection, you can use the allow forms directive to do that.
Does the iframe actually adhere to the standard of the page? Or I set one of these things up a long time ago, but it seemed like it didn't adhere to the standard. Like if the page was an HTTPS page, the iframe was not necessarily also HTTPS. It could be unencrypted. I may be misremembering that.
No, I think you're on something.
Well, if you're remembering that it would load the iframe, that was the case, yes. Depends a bit on how far back your memories go, because nowadays it would count as mixed content. And I'm not saying all browsers are going to block it, but some browsers, many browsers will block it. But you mentioned memory, so if you go, I think, 5 or 10 years back, then yes, you would see that. However, for form submissions, I would imagine even back then, most browsers would warn you that you're about to submit content through an unencrypted connection if the parent page, the main page, was served over an encrypted connection.
I just remember I was setting up some kind of a payment thing that was really early, and we got like a plug-in for. I had to learn how to do this, and that was when I was learning about iframes, because it was like, how do we get this to work and put it in there? And I think it was before the browsers would automatically reject that unencrypted content, because we noticed that. And we thought, well, the page is secure. And then I started thinking, but is this frame thing secure? Because I didn't really understand it. And I started doing some experiments on it, and it was not. And I was like, okay, this is bad. Yeah, we wouldn't want to do this. So,
hold on, I get that right. So your site was secure, but the payment processor was unencrypted?
Yeah.
That is.
It was, yeah. Wow. That was probably like 15 years ago, and it was really not a good idea. And it was when people were first starting to ask those kind of questions. And honestly, everybody thought I was crazy because I was running a secure page for that at all. It was just, and the processor we were using was just like, it wasn't like a credit card company. It was like a third party that was going to do this through a bank. And they were like, you want to do what? And I was like, can we encrypt this? And they were like, I don't think so. That's not going to work. So yeah, it was a little scary.
It's amazing because by that time SSL was around for
but people weren't using it, and it was considered an overhead problem. It was considered a complication that you didn't need, and these processors were trying to go for maximum speed, and I guess a lot of people didn't understand it and support it, so they just hadn't switched it over. It was just some little dinky company that was like a locally owned company that was supporting a conference. And I was like, yeah, but you're sending this payment information over like public airways. And they were like, yeah, but it's on the internet.
Different, secure.
Yeah.
Sounds like very early days, yes.
Yeah, early days.
And I guess probably by now, PCI DSS would break that company immediately. So,
probably.
But anyway, let me continue. There are other interesting directives that I would like to talk about for a bit. For instance, there is allow modals, which allows you to That's another interesting point, actually. Sandbox will block things like the JavaScript alert, like the JavaScript prompt, like the JavaScript confirm. And for those listeners who don't really know what they do, alert is like a message box, and prompt is like an input box. It's like a message box with a little text box. They can type in very simple numbers or letters. And those are blocked, and they're blocked for a good reason, because once they are visible, you are unable to interact with the underlying page. So to give an example, you have an iframe to some advertiser, and without the sandbox or with the allow modals directive, the advertiser would be able to show sort of a pop-up window that you have to interact with just to get back to the parent page. And obviously that is not what you want to allow most iframes to do. So you have to be careful here. Now, there are reasons to allow that. I think I don't see any, but the point is you need to be careful when you use that directive, because it takes focus away, and it's also misleading about where that message box is coming from. And also in the case of the prompt window, like I said, you can enter something. It's not always clear where that information is going. So a malicious advertiser or a hacked advertiser, they might actually show that prompt window through an iframe, ask for some personal information, and the victim would think that this window came from your site. So that's the reason why it's being blocked by default with the Sandbox attribute, and why in general we have to be careful about this one. There is a non-malicious problem with this, and that's that some websites might actually show error messages in the form of an alert window, especially in debug mode. And you don't want to have somebody else's error message on your homepage, basically. So there's very, very little reason to allow for alerts, for prompts, or for confirmed windows to be allowed from iframes.
Don't some people use that, though, as a kind of restrictor? So they pop that up and make you, like, you got to put your name in. So they pop a box of with that, and you can't get back onto the page without doing it.
They do, and it's a terrible thing, so we don't allow it.
Now, wait a minute.
Yeah, like, please re-enter your password.
Well,
if I were to construct an attack, I'd be like, hey, your session timed out, please enter
Mine was
your password.
legit. They had to put their hotel room number in, so I had to pop it up, and the hotel was going to charge us by the user, and so we were trying to associate it with rooms from our blocks. I mean, obviously they could lie. We didn't do any validation of it, but these were like academics. They didn't even know what was going on. It just popped. I mean, yeah, you could have hacked them to pieces, but it just popped a window. It shifted focus, popped open a box, and said, please enter your room number. And we were using that to collect data about people that were using our Wi-Fi internet at the conference hotel ballroom. And we just put that together. It was probably terribly coded, but they weren't paying me very much. In fact, they weren't paying me at all. So,
I'm sure there are some great reasons, but I think in most cases you don't want to allow iframes or iframe content.
That's what I like to
do
hear.
That.
Statute of limitations run out on that a while ago, so it'll be okay.
Yeah. So my question is, within the iframe sandboxing settings, are there any things that we shouldn't do because it could allow the iframe to escape the sandbox?
Ooh.
Yes, there is, and actually I was hoping to get to that in about 10 minutes.
Oh, that's
so.
I can wait.
No, because I want to lay the framework so that we all understand how it might be possible to escape the iframe. And so I'll just talk about another interesting directive. Then we're almost 50% there, and then I'll talk about the second directive that allows us to escape the iframe. So the first one actually is the allow scripts, because and now it gets interesting with scripting with JavaScript and iframes. The directive is called allow scripts, which is quite straightforward. And I think nowadays it would be hard-pressed to find useful widgets that we embed with an iframe that do not use JavaScript. So in many, if not most cases, we have to allow scripts even in a sandboxed iframe. So that is actually one of the reasons why many developers who, for the first time, embed some external iframe code, they run into issues once they use Sandbox because nothing works. So they Google a solution and they just add allow scripts, and then they add some other directives, they add some other permissions just to make sure that things work, basically. But it's always important to be aware of security implications. And in the case of allow scripts, in the case of JavaScript, like I said, nowadays it will be very difficult to find useful content that can be embedded that does not need JavaScript. So allow scripts is almost necessary. And I think it's more useful to think about it in a way, when do I not need it? I mean, when do I not need JavaScript? And if I'm sure that I do not need JavaScript because I'm just embedding some static image or something like that, then it doesn't hurt.
Yeah,
but in general, I think...
Even with ads, Ben, those aren't just an image. It's usually JavaScript wrapped around it for the tracking links and things of that nature.
Absolutely, yes. And tracking, like you said, pretty much anything nowadays needs JavaScript. There are some great browser extensions to disable JavaScript on embedded iframes on third-party content in general. They make navigation much easier, but of course it's not that great for commercial reasons. So
ad blockers will do that, but then a lot of sites complain that you have an ad blocker. So that actually makes me want to go find one that blocks an iframe with JavaScript from a third-party resource. I wonder if the site would know that I'm running an ad if it's not an ad blocker plugin.
It would.
It's a bit of a cat and mouse game.
Yeah.
You have that ad blocker, then the site discovers that you're using an ad blocker, then you install some whitelist on your ad blocker or some blacklist that blocks certain content of that page that actually determines if you're using an ad blocker. And yeah, like I said, cat and mouse game. So
right. Yeah, because it goes the other way. Sometimes I have to disable an ad blocker on a site that doesn't have ads, but it thinks they're ads, so it's blocking the functionality.
And sometimes you wonder, was it not much nicer to navigate the web like 20 years ago? Okay, we have frame sets, but at least we didn't have that.
It's true.
So, yeah. And then there is... So I was just talking about allow scripts. Now, another interesting directive is the allow same origin directive. Because what the sandbox does is, and now it's getting a bit more technical, what the sandbox does is it forces a different, or it treats the iframe content as if it were on a different origin, even if it's actually on the same site. So let's say your example.org, you have an iframe, and that iframe refers to example.org/page2. And it will still treat that iframe as a different origin, even if it's on the same site. Or let's say you have an iframe that points to, again, I use the social media site as an example. It might not allow the cookie access that you need. So with the allow same origin, you actually allow the iframed site to access that iframe in the context of same origin policy.
And is that session specific or cookie specific, or most sessions handled by cookies anyhow?
That was a bit of a convoluted question. If you
does the origin policy simply restrict the access to cookies, or does it restrict access to the session in general? But is the session really just maintained by session cookies anyhow?
The entire browsing context, I would call it.
Okay.
So it's not just about cookies.
Gotcha.
But again, the interesting thing is that you suddenly have your iframe on a different origin, even if it's on the same, if it has the same origin, and that is something that trips up a lot of first-time users of the Sandbox attribute, which is why we have the allow same origin attribute. Now I get back to what I said about 10 minutes ago, because 10 minutes ago I promised that I would get back to it in 10 minutes, and that time has come. If we combine the allow scripts directive with the allow same origin directive, then when the embedded page has the same origin as the page containing the iframe, then it will be possible for the iframe page to use scripting to break out of that iframe.
Yeah, so basically...
And I'm not sure who asked that question, but I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, so it means my code runs in the context of that session, which means it can do anything that the user or the application can do in that context.
Pretty much, yes. And similarly, you have things like allow top navigation, which effectively allows the page to navigate or load content to the top level browsing context. So if the keyword, if this directive is not used, then this operation is not allowed. So you have to really opt in here in order to be able to navigate the parent from within the iframe. And that requires a lot of trust. It allows basically the iframe to, you could just say, redirect the visitor.
Right.
And that's why we have, by the way, we have something else. We have a version of allow top navigation that requires user activation or user interaction. It's called by user activation, but personally, I think user interaction is a bit, is probably the more descriptive of how it works. And it allows for additional granularity because it does not allow the iframe to simply break out and redirect unsuspecting users. So if you have a use case where your iframe really requires to break out to change the top navigation, it might be best to use the user activation option, just from a security, but also a user experience point of view.
Yeah, that could be pretty dangerous in a phishing context. If I go to a legitimate website, it loads a malicious iframe that then redirects me to a copy of that page that's controlled by an attacker. That could be a pretty dangerous phishing attack.
Absolutely, yes. And we see that a lot of malicious ads that actually do that. And it could all be avoided if the main website that embeds the iframe did not use this directive. But like I said, in many cases, the directives are being used without being fully understood. And that's a problem. But it happens because obviously developers want things to work. So you just become a bit more permissive in what you do, and maybe you don't fully understand what the ultimate impact of that directive can be once the iframe content turns malicious.
So what's the security context if my iframe pops up a pop-up or a new tab or window within the browser? Is that then, can it reach back to the other stuff, or is it still isolated and bound by other security policies? Is that a risk?
Well, it's definitely a risk from the user experience point of view, because when you as a user are on a website, then you sort of trust what is happening on that website. And I think the example you mentioned was a pop-up. If you have a pop-up popping up that looks a lot like the website, that resembles the original website that you are browsing, then it becomes very easy to trust that page, even though it's actually not the site that you think you are browsing. And similarly, for example, there's the allow downloads directive as well, which allows iframes to spawn download windows. And that's a great way to spread malware if you're not careful.
So lots of ways you could get in trouble, but this still seems like in total, we really should be encouraging use of this when we're using iframes to really control what they can do.
Absolutely, yes. My suggestion is use the Sandbox attribute, and I think we in general we should not be too permissive in what we allow to happen within the sandbox. There should be a clear use case for each and every single directive that we set within the iframe attribute, because otherwise, if you allow everything, what is the purpose of the sandbox?
Oh, now you're reminding me back of some application development where you set a bunch of permissions and you use them all the time because they just work, rather than explicitly deciding what should be on or off. It sounds like
the easiest path here is to not do all that stuff, because the default lets just about everything run. And so people get in the habit of doing that, and then when they try this, it doesn't work, and then they immediately fall back to just get rid of the sandbox attribute and it'll work. Then you got problems.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. And so in general, what we see, I would say the three most common misconfigurations, or at least problematic configuration. Obviously, the one is iframes with external resources that have no sandbox at all. That is a problem. But then we have also sandboxes that allow scripts and allow same origin, which is what I've mentioned a few minutes ago, which allows the iframe basically to break out of the iframe and therefore to break out of the sandbox as well. And the third one is actually when you have external resources being loaded into an iframe that allow scripts or allow top navigation, or allow pop-ups to escape sandbox, because it might be possible for pop-ups to escape the sandbox. I mean, there are also some not really security-specific directives in Sandbox, so it's not all that bad if you give some permissions, if you're a little lenient. For example, you can allow iframes to lock screen orientation. When you have a tablet or a smartphone, websites may want to lock the automatic orientation when you change the position of your tablet. And there may be good reasons for that. For example, I'm aware of one government site. They publish laws as PDFs and they embed it into an iframe. Now, if you turn your tablet around by 90 degrees, then suddenly it cuts off certain pieces of the legal document, which is not so great when you want to rely on a law and you see only half of it. So there's a good use case for allowing iframes to lock the orientation of the page, but I think those are edge cases. Similarly, you can allow iframes to lock the pointer, which basically gives the iframe the permission to access mouse movements beyond the edges of the iframe. There are some privacy risks here, depending on the surrounding web page. I mean, the page that surrounds, that embeds the iframe. But there are also some good reasons. Let's say you're embedding games in your website or very specialized applications. So there may be good reasons for that as well.
So is anybody going to produce a guide, best practices, white paper for this? Because it sure seems like I could get tripped up if I didn't have really good guidance.
That's a good point.
There is good guidance out there. I think the easiest way is just to use Invicti security products, because we check for a lot of common misconfigurations and we check for room for optimization. So we look at all the iframes that we can find on a website, which are usually plenty. We check all of them. We check for the context of the iframe. We check for the configuration of the iframe. And if anything seems off, then we not only alert the user, but we also provide some input, some suggestion on how to improve the iframe sandbox configuration.
Nice. I need all the help I can get. So,
well, yeah, because we kind of have a matrix, right, of different options that could. Are there combinations that are worse than other combinations, or like basically, obviously, no sandboxing would allow for all of the bad things to happen?
I would say the one really bad combination is allow scripts and allow same origin.
Yeah. Because
when you have script access to something that is treated as the same origin, then yes, bad things can happen.
Yeah, essentially you're letting someone else write your web application for you if they so choose.
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah.
And giving them access to everything on your system at the same time.
Right. Yeah, the same origin for me was really scary.
Yeah. That's
speaking of letting somebody else writing your website for you, one interesting observation might be that many sandbox problems happen when the web page is dynamically creating iframes, because for developers, I guess it's easier to set up the correct sandbox configuration when you define or when you write the static HTML code than when you create iframes dynamically with JavaScript on the fly. So that is something that can be difficult to find in code because, like I said, it's created dynamically. And in that case, it will be much easier to discover misconfigurations when you're using a dust tool like Akinetics or NetSparker.
Yeah, scanning in runtime is, you still need to do that. I think we'll always need to do that because, like you said, Ben, the ultimate code and configuration that runs is different from when you've scanned those various other environments or the components individually. Mm-hmm. It's like when it all comes together in production, things are different.
Very true. I mean, just think of iframes that load dynamic content, and by dynamic I mean dynamic URLs. You might have a website where for some reason you load an iframe with user provided URLs. Then it's very difficult to tell during development, will it be a local, or a page on the same origin, or will it be an external origin? And those are things that you can only really assess with a dust tool like Akinetics or NetSparker.
There was that was stuff that got there was some DNS poisoning type stuff on that too, right? That was poisoning the URLs that were getting pulled into the frames, and I remember reading something about that where it's like you poison the name of what's going in the frame locally, and then that it pulls up a different frame. It looks like that's what's supposed to be there, but it's really something else.
I think there was something where the malicious website generates a lot of iframes on the fly to basically create those DNS requests.
Yeah, it was something like that. I was remembering I read something and was going, hey, I probably have that. Mm-hmm. I'm not your go-to web design.
Yeah, there's a lot of different components and a lot of different ways to put all these pieces together. So
yeah,
and iframes are common. I mean, they're in most websites you visit today, I would imagine, right?
And most people, I think, they don't use what Ben's talking about at all, because it's just, it sounds complicated because it's, so sandboxing, and people say, well, I don't know if I want to get involved in that. I got this working. I don't want to mess with it. And then because this is how they've always done it, and it's hard to get them to shift.
Mm-hmm.
And once you start using Sandbox for the first time, something is almost inevitably going to break.
Yep, right.
Then you have to figure out how to do it properly, but it's worth it. It's a bit like a content security policy. You add one to your site for the first time, something's going to break, but once you figure out how to do it right, you really increase the security of your website and of your visitors as well.
And that's why it's important to have security people in your design team too, because a lot of times design people just do it the way they've always done it, the way that works fastest, and getting people in there to say you really need to be doing this, maybe they'll take the time to fix it. Correct,
yes. Alternatively, have a dust tool that tells you that something needs to be changed.
Well, yeah. I mean, that ought to be part of your audit, right? I mean, you should be doing that pretty regular.
You should, yes.
I mean,
because after all, the context can change. Like I said, you might be suddenly be loading external content in your iframe, and you used to load only same origin content, and then you may have to change your sandbox directive a little bit.
And a lot of that's gotten even more automated with all that dynamic stuff too, right? So you don't know what if you're pulling in third-party stuff, that stuff can change over time as well. So you have to kind of keep up with it on a regular basis. That would be my policy recommendation.
Yes, depends a bit on how lenient your sandbox directives are to begin with. If you start with a very strict policy, then you may not have to review it all the time. But if you are, if you permit a lot of things, then yes, you should review that regularly, because as you said, the iframe content might change over time. And the trustworthiness of advertisers may change as well.
How often do you think people should do that?
Depends a bit on the target. Depends a bit on how important the target is. If it's your main website, do it as often as possible, in the sense that it makes sense in the overall business context. But in general, use a dust tool that allows for scheduled scans, so you don't even have to think about it.
sounding a little bit like we need to treat this in the category of web application scans in terms of need to do this, need to verify it.
Yes, and like I said, if you use the right scanner, then that scanner should take care of it as well. Because from a scanner perspective, it is very easy to look at the DOM, to look at the document object model of the web pages, and to recognize iframes as such. And then it's very easy to look at sandbox configurations and sandbox and iframe content, iframe resources. And it's much easier to do that automatically than to even try and do it manually.
It's good stuff, Ben. Do you have a blog post or reference on this, or is this more about what's kind of built into the product in terms of guidance for the user?
Both, actually. It's built into the product, so users don't even have to think about it if they don't want to. If they do want to think about it, just run a search for Akinetics iframes or Akinetics Sandbox, and you'll find some blog post. You'll find a blog post with advice and general guidance on how to secure your website.
Fantastic. Ben, thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly.
Thanks for having me.
Again, this segment is sponsored by Invicti. You can visit securityweekly.com/Invicti to learn more. That will conclude this edition of Paul's Security Weekly. Thanks everyone for listening and watching. Over and out.